and I will be hosting and moderating today's webinar titled Three Experts in Security. And this is kind of a joy for me. So with me today is Stan, Jeff, and Neil, whom you will get to know each of them a little bit better here as we go. We're going to try to keep this to 1 hour for the webinar, and we'll be getting through a number of different topics and points which I think are going to be extremely relevant for you. And I first wanted to introduce what Vivid is. I think the majority of the people on the webinar today are familiar with Vivid, and also knowing that we do have a special interest group titled Security and Privacy. But as an organization, Vivid is a nonprofit organization. It was started back in 1993. There are over 40,000 members worldwide. There's also this independent HPE software user community. So again, we're able to provide this unbiased and uncensored and field-tested experience for all of the different customers of the HPE software suites. Again, Vivid is not just for practitioners. If you were to look up the makeup of our members, what you would find is about 50% of those parties are practitioners and the other half being decision makers. So again, a nice variety of folks. The picture in front of you, these are the board of directors, again, taken, I guess, about a year ago. So again, wanted to give you the very quick overview of Vivid, as well as noticing that, yes, there is a security and privacy special interest group where many of these types of topics are spoken about. You can also look at ones that have been done historically. This webinar is actually coming from a live Delaware local user group meeting that we had back on the 17th of May, just a few weeks ago. Our sponsor for that event was Melillo Consulting. So wanted to, again, thank them for their sponsorship, not only of the event, but also the support of the Vivid Worldwide organization and what we're bringing to the community. So this slide shows, some of the pictures of the voices that you will be seeing and hearing from today. Myself, you can see I work for a company called CSC. Also, Scott was the sponsor from Melillo Consulting. You'll also hear from Stan from Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, as well as Jeff from Caveros and Neil from SageNet. I've asked each of them to provide brief introductions to themselves as they get ready to start on the content that they will be delivering. So they will be doing that as well, so you can get to know them a little bit more. Before we move right into the content, I wanted to provide a little bit of housekeeping. If you are new to this platform, again, it's very simple for you to use it and leverage it, but what you'll see is this is a live session. It is being recorded. It will be available to all Vivid members, so again, feel free to share it with your peers, with some of the other people that you may work with as well, that this content would be extraordinarily helpful for and learning from. The other piece, if you haven't done so already, one of the features I love in this platform is the ability to choose your local language. So again, you can see on the left-hand side of your browser here a selection where you can select the flag to designate that language which you would like to ask your questions. So without further ado, we're going to move forward in our agenda today. And again, Stan's going to be covering the true state of security in DevOps, which will move us nicely into Jeff's discussion around securing DevOps and how to integrate security into the DevOps processes. And Neil's going to go ahead and close it out for us. So you think your application is secure, now what? So the thing that was very interesting when we did this event as a local user group is this flow worked quite well in kind of the topics that we covered and kind of moving us from thinking about it, kind of how does security play more so in kind of a DevOps, earlier stage, then how do we integrate that into some of these processes and automate them from Jeff, and then lastly, okay, now we're in operations, how is it that we go ahead and leverage again, this three experts in security and thinking about what we should be doing today, looking forward to 2018. So without further ado, Stan, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. If you wouldn't mind, again, doing a very brief introduction of yourself and then going ahead and going through your content. And I would just ask that you hand it to Jeff. Jeff, you hand it to Neil, and then I'll come back on just to close this out. Thank you, Stan.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, I really enjoyed the interaction we had at the chapter meeting last month, and I'm really glad we have an opportunity to have an encore online session today. A little background on myself. I got started at National Security Agency back in the early 80s. We were focused on securing operating systems and working with vendors and integrating their security features into their products. Since then, I've been building security into various platforms and organizations. Got involved with application security back in the early 2000s, doing software security, actually at Jeff's old firm, and led their security practice, and then worked at Booz Allen. Prior to joining HPE in 2010, I was the Chief Information Security Officer at Fannie Mae, and had an opportunity to stand up an application security program there, along with others. It's a journey with many hands. The role I'm in at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise is security strategist, and I support our larger customers on the East Coast and our security products division as far as helping them with their ArcSight, their secure data, as well as their Fortify implementations. So what I want to focus on today is DevOps, and we talk to a lot of different organizations that are struggling on how best to deploy secure applications in the context of DevOps as their dev team makes this transition. DevOps is a term that's still a bit ambiguous, sort of similar to what we ran into with cloud computing around 5 to 7 years ago. In general, DevOps is a practice that emphasizes collaboration and it has a goal of automating the process of rapid application delivery. There are frequent software builds, which could be resulting in builds of daily, weekly, or monthly releases. But you don't have to be a Netflix and have multiple releases a day to be in DevOps. The objective simply is faster delivery of high-quality applications to market. Now, numerous experts have been predicting that DevOps will result in more secure applications. There are a lot of articles and even books that cite this. But is that really happening? HPE Security's Fortify team wanted to discover what's really going on. You know, these organizations implementing DevOps, are they at scale? And when they are implementing DevOps, are they actually integrating security in and pushing more secure applications out into production? So HPE surveyed a wide range of industry leaders and security practitioners and developers and looked at both the promise and the reality of the influence of DevOps on the secure SDLC. The resulting report from the study is actually available for download as one of the files associated with the webinar. There's also an infographic that gives you a summary of the report. So I encourage you to download those files. And I'm going to provide an overview of the study results and then hand over the baton to Jeff for his perspectives on best practices of integrating security into DevOps. Now, 90% of the survey participants are pursuing some level of DevOps implementations, even if it's just a pilot program. The most common adopted practices of DevOps identified in the study included frequent deployment, automated testing, and integrated teams. That's not a surprise. Most survey participants were still struggling to become more agile when the DevOps trend came into the scene. And ideally, they want to implement both rather than just one over the other because they work hand in hand. Now, the promise of DevOps increasing application security adoption is centered on the belief that security must be part of the DevOps process. and not a separate function. The study found that 99% of all respondents agree with this, that adopting a DevOps culture is an important way of potentially improving application security. However, the reality of the security adoption of the folks we talked to proved to be different than the promise. Only 20% stated that secure SDLC testing is done throughout development. During qualitative interviews, it became clear that mature security organizations where application security is historically an integrated part of development, those are the ones that continue to prioritize security and include it as a critical component of DevOps. If organizations were doing it well before, they're most likely doing it well now as they implement DevOps. But if you weren't very good at securing the SDLC before, the move to DevOps alone is not going to solve that problem. And when asked how organizations adopting DevOps are currently protecting applications, the overwhelming majority cited security practices or controls downstream of the SDLC, relying on pre-production pen testing and network security controls. And as we know, those are inadequate. Those are not as effective as building it into the actual software development lifecycle. A shocking 17% say they have no integration security and don't have any controls or technology in place to protect their applications. So all these findings lead to the question of why. Why is this the case? Given the number of breaches we're hearing about and the impact of insecure applications have on an organization, what's preventing them from ensuring that application security is part of DevOps? We have to look at the fact that standard pressures on developers to keep focused on features and fixes associated with a sprint. And security, if it's not a priority, it's not going to be addressed. And that's why it's important to include security evangelists, or whatever label you want to put on that, into the development work groups. And we found that that wasn't happening in a lot of places. And if you don't have security at the table, chances are they're not going to include those as requirements. We also noted that when we're looking at job recs, security is not a priority when hiring development resources. Most software development positions don't require any awareness of secure coding best practices. So expectations aren't being properly set for developers coming in. And we need to have a security-aware development culture in our firms. And that starts with a hiring process. Actually, it probably starts much before that in their education. But you need to set the bar to let them know that it is something that's important. And there are other reasons that security is left behind, and actually Jeff will touch upon some of those in his section. So what's needed is repeatable integrated security practices. That's what's required for our continuous development and continuous integration environments. Applications require regular security assessments from various angles. A combination of testing and assessment techniques work best at identify security design flaws and implementation defects. The feedback on these identified weaknesses needs to get back to the dev teams quickly so they can mitigate the risks. The application security testing should be embedded into the DevOps tool chain to make security testing easy and transparent as possible. We don't want to slow down the developments of apps, but we do need to ensure that the risk is visible to decision makers and mitigated appropriately. Now, finally, apps will likely get pushed to production with vulnerabilities, and we need to have continuous monitoring and runtime protection. So the objective of DevOps security testing is to minimize the friction that security testing can cause in that continuous application deployment pipeline, while effectively identifying security defects to the dev teams in a timely remediation time, so they can timely remediate those vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So I'm just going to real briefly share how we fit into this as far as our product suite. Fortify is the only application security testing portfolio to offer technologies that span the entire SDLC. We have static, dynamic, and interactive application security testing along with runtime application self-protection. And we can enable security testing to happen faster at the various points of the lifecycle. Now, this enables security testing feedback to get back to the developers in a timely manner, and our offerings are available on-prem as well as on demand and can easily plug into the DevOps tool chains. We provide RESTful APIs for most of our tools and have a marketplace of various plugins to help with this integration. And we also have a real powerful software security research team, and their knowledge is funneled into and back into the tools, and they provide also quarterly and ad hoc updates as needed. So I'm now going to hand it over to my friend Jeff, who's helped organizations build reliable and secure applications for over 2 decades now. So Jeff, take it away.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it, and good to hear your voice again. So my name is Jeff Payne. I'm the founder and CEO of Coverys. Prior to starting Coverys almost a decade ago now, I ran a software assurance company called Cigital. That was the company that Stan and I had the opportunity to work together for many years. It was great, where we focused on application security and helping people build security into their applications from the ground up. Stan and I could probably talk forever about the report that was done by HPE. It's a fascinating topic, but I'm going to get down into the best practices that we've seen at Coverys for integrating security into a DevOps process. Our business at Coverys is software development. We help organizations build and deliver secure code using agile methods. So we are an agile development shop, a DevOps shop. We believe strongly in the principles of agile and incremental development as a way to build and deploy good software. But we also know and believe that it needs to be secure. And you need to figure out how to do security in an incremental, rapid fashion. Otherwise, as Stan mentioned, you're always going to end up at the end of your process before you go to production with a very costly and often lengthy security process that if everything works, you only go through once, but unfortunately, if you have issues, is going to result in a lot of rework and additional activity to get to production, which in DevOps is a big no-no. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the best practices that we have discovered helping people with DevOps and integrating security in. We have done a lot of DevOps implementations at Coverys, and we work with all sorts of organizations to both put DevOps tool chains in place, but also integrate security into that process as we go. So the first best practice I want to talk about is what I call continuous security. Security analysis and testing needs to be part of the upfront continuous integration processes and practices that you should be doing every day as part of an Agile process and a DevOps process. Your goal in Agile and DevOps is to be building releasable software on a very regular basis. And as Stan mentioned, that doesn't mean you have to become Netflix. You don't have to try to push code into production, every hour. It may be weeks or even months before you actually push into production, but that doesn't mean you don't continually assure what you're building so that you incrementally make sure that what you have works. The way we do that at Coverys is using a few techniques. First of all, before code even gets checked in by a software developer, we advocate that some set of lightweight code analysis techniques be applied to code changes to make sure that the code is as secure as you can really expect it to be or make it to be when you're just looking at small changes to code. And there's a couple of different ways you can do that. One is you can put lightweight code scanners onto the desktops of your developers. We like some of the open source tools out there, like Yaska and PMD and FindBugs and others that are quick and dirty, so they don't take a lot of time to run, but they will give you a first pass at security analysis. HPE also has a great new product, Security Assistant, that sits into and plugs into your IDE. And as you type and write code, we'll look for whether you're violating security principles and give you some highlighted information on ways you could improve your code from a security perspective. We definitely advocate using something like Security Assistant as well on the development desktops. The whole DevOps process starts, though, when code is checked into a version control system, some sort of source control repository that you have set up, whether it be Git or Subversion, whatever you like to use. Checking code in starts the process of, pushing code toward delivery in our world. And so the first thing we want to do when that occurs is do some amount of testing on the changes that have been checked in to make sure that things are working properly. And we like to put into that the same type of code analysis that we would typically ask a developer to do on their workstation. We are going to ask Jenkins, an automated build control system, to check and validate the security in a lightweight manner every time new code is checked in to the repository. In addition, if there are any security controls or anything about the units or components that you're building as part of your functionality or your features, your stories that you're checking in, you would like to do some unit level security testing to make sure things like authentication and authorization are handled properly. If you're encrypting or decrypting information or you're sending encrypted, decrypted traffic, that your units are doing those things properly and effective. And last but not least, in continuous integration, you should be integrating your code changes on a very regular basis. We always say at least once a day in a nightly build, but oftentimes more than that if you can afford to do that. And you really would like to do more detailed security analysis in your integrated builds within whatever window you have to run the analysis that you might be interested in, whether that be secure code analysis with something like Fortify SCA, or security testing of your web-based app, or other types of security analysis that you have automated. You want to run those things as much as you can in the time you have available. People always ask me, how much security analysis do you try to get into continuous integration? And my answer is always, it really depends on the window of time you have, right? If you're on a physical server and it's virtualized, but you only have access to it for testing purposes between, say, midnight and 5 a.m., you're going to integrate and run regression tests and other types of analysis in that window. And you're going to probably do as much analysis as you can afford to do in that window. If instead you're virtualized, but you're also in the cloud, and you've got elastic demand, and you can set up test environments at your beck and call, maybe you decide every hour to spin up and do a continuous integration run of your code and regression test it. And maybe you do that on an hourly basis. Maybe you even parallelize that, so you have different types of testing and analysis running at the same time during that period of time. So it really depends on what you have to run and the time window you have. I always say that one challenge you have is upfront early in your process, which is where continuous integration is. You are more interested in rapid feedback. So we don't want long-running feedback analysis while someone sits and waits for results. We want to fit it into the windows of time we think are appropriate, but we care more about rapid feedback back to the team than we do about stability. Stability and no surprises will come later in the process. The second best practice, and you've heard this about DevOps and assurance in general, I'm sure, is to push security left in the process. The more stuff we do at the end, probably the longer and harder it's going to be to deploy working code on a regular basis. And so we want to push as much of our security testing and compliance analysis into our QA process that we're doing within sprints, for instance, if we're using Scrum. The more security tests and analysis we can get done every sprint as we incrementally build our code, the less there's going to be left to do after we decide it's time to push to production to make sure we get final sign-offs and everything meets any standards or regulatory processes that we have to practice. Two thoughts there. The first thing is that there are some things that are pretty easy to move out of kind of an end-of-life cycle processing and move earlier in the process. One would be your security testing itself. I have here risk-based security testing, and all that means is that typically when you're thinking through how you're going to approach testing from a security perspective, you're going to want to understand the threats. You'll probably have done some threat modeling on your app, some architectural risk analysis to identify, where are the crown jewels and assets that I care about, and what are the paths and various components that I know protect those, and what are the controls that I put in place to protect. And I want to test to make sure all that stuff works. And so I'm going to concentrate my security testing in certain areas. The second thing is if you're using open source components or frameworks, which at this point almost everybody is, you had better check to make sure you're using versions of those frameworks and components that themselves are secure. A lot of times software developers don't like to use the most recent version of a framework, say of, for instance, Struts, because they know upgrading to a new version might break their code and they're going to have rework associated with it. But over time, some information might become available that says there's vulnerabilities in that old version that you don't even realize that you have. And so there are good tools, open source and commercial tools, to check your open source version and let you know if there are any known, particularly critical vulnerabilities in the versions of open source components that you have. It'll also check your licensing as well. If you have licensing restrictions on the types of open source you can use and the licensing that is appropriate in your org, you can check for that as well. In terms of checking for compliance and doing testing and reviews according to regulatory or industry standards, as well as ongoing penetration testing and system testing, the amount that you can actually push into your sprints for these will often be determined by, one, can you get internal audit or other compliance officers to be an active part of your sprints? And two is, how production-like or production-ready are the environments that you have access to in QA and test? Some types of security testing, to be effective, really need to be performed on the application in its production-like environment, because it's not only testing the app, but it's testing the interaction of the app with its environment. And one of the best practices in DevOps is trying to, as much as possible, make all of your environments, from dev to test to production, all look the same, so that you can push more and more analysis, not just for security, but for load and performance and other types of quality characteristics as early in the process as you can. We want to do that with security as well. The third best practice is you can't forget about the tool chain itself. So in DevOps, we try to automate the movement of code all the way from development through test and into production, setting up and establishing environments automatically as we can. This shifts our environment problem from a manual setup problem to a now I have code, we call it infrastructure as code, that in itself must be secure. And so we need to assure our infrastructure as code as we build it, and also the environments that come out of it to make sure that that code doesn't do something that results in an environment that is not secure. My belief and my thought is that you need to do security on both the code itself and the provisioned environment. As you find problems in the environment, though, you go back and you fix the infrastructure as code. You don't just patch the environment. One of the goals in DevOps is that we move all infrastructure into code, but that as we find problems with that code, we don't just patch in our environments, we patch the code so next time it's done properly. We need to do that with security as well. And don't forget that if you're starting to use containers like Docker. We need to make sure we analyze and monitor for malicious code so that malicious code doesn't go along for the ride. Much like we often say, you got to be careful in DevOps of pushing, crappy code into production because your testing process isn't good. You're just speeding up the production of crappy code if your testing isn't good. We need to make sure that malware doesn't somehow get itself into this process and get pushed into production automatically by our DevOps tool chain. The last best practice that I want to talk about is about getting your security team into the DevOps process and practice. As Stan mentioned, DevOps is around collaboration and communication. Automation is just a facilitator for helping to support the team and speed up some of the buggy manual processes and practices that we have traditionally had as part of our release and production processes. We want to get and need to get our security team integrated into our DevOps team and involved in our sprints, as we talked earlier. If you've read the book, The Phoenix Project, which is one of my favorite DevOps books by Gene Kim, there is a security person talked about in that book, and up front, that person isn't looked upon very favorably, and that's not a surprise because oftentimes security has been considered a hurdle, and the security team has been considered a hurdle to get to production. And in DevOps, we're looking to remove hurdles, not have them, and certainly not have them late in the process. And so pulling your security team in earlier and getting them involved day to day to make sure that the developers, the testers, the release managers, those involved in building infrastructure as code understand what's needed from a security perspective and can start to analyze and scan for those things earlier in the process are going to just result in more trust with the security team, and that's going to result in quicker deliveries and deployments. One note, as security tools, such as pen test tools, web app security tools, code scanning tools, start moving into the DevOps process, and they're just part of day-to-day assurance activities, the security team doesn't typically they don't really own the running of those security tools anymore because they are part of the automated process that we have in place. And instead, their role shifts to analyzing the results, triaging with the DevOps team anything that looks security critical, making sure that any security defects are prioritized and corrected so that they are in situ part of the development process instead of a gate at the end of the entire practice. Now, in terms of HPE software, and Stan showed a graph similar to this. This shows a typical kind of left to right movement of code from build and integration to quality assurance to staging and pre-production and then ultimately into production. And where you typically see different types of tools. I mentioned SCA, code scanning, which gets used early in the process during continuous integration. In addition, Security Assistant that can be used on the desktop. I talked a little bit about security testing. One critical piece, if you're web-based, is web security testing, and Web Inspect is a great product for that. We use it both as part of our regression testing in continuous integration and also in QA to do deeper analysis and also attack our applications. And then, for those known vulnerabilities or issues that you have and to monitor for security in production, you're going to want to use something like App Defender and put that in place. Well, that runs in production. You're actually going to put it in place during your QA and your earlier life cycle, and you're going to push it along into production like you will any other monitoring capability that you would want ultimately to be in production. It's going to be just part of the package that gets pushed into production with your application. So I want to note, if you want to get going quickly on integrating security into your DevOps process, we have developed an open source tool at Coveris. It's called SecureCI. It's a pretty standard stack of open source tools that allow you to do everything from check-in code to run unit tests to run functional tests security tests, look at the results, and do other things associated with your CI process. That already has a set of integrated security tools in it that can help you in your journey. It's free off our website. You can contact me if you want more information on it. But it's quick and dirty, pre-integrated set of tools. There's an AMI to run in Amazon as well. It's freely available for anyone that's interested in getting started with security integrated into DevOps. So with that, I'll turn it over to Neil, and he can pick up from here. Neil?
All right, Jeff, thanks a lot. That was very helpful. Every time I hear you say it, I hear another nugget of good information. So hopefully everybody out there is getting some good data as well. So just to kind of give you a brief introduction of myself, my name is Neil Christie. I'm a Director of Cybersecurity Operations at SageNet. I won't go into a marketing spiel of what we do, but based off of the things that we talk about, you can obviously construe some things. But I've been in cybersecurity operations for a long time on the customer side, and sort of decided to make it a more of a general consulting and implementation of the things that I've learned through the years. And I think this is a great opportunity in the security landscape to have a time with developers and operations folks to visit some topics that you likely have heard in the past, but because of a restructuring and a new way of doing things, taking the agile methodology and transforming it not only from a development standpoint, but into a how to deliver it to operational mode is very interesting to me, where we can look back into those things and how can what the decisions you're making in development and operations, how it affects security operations. So that's really what I'm going to try and do here, because you're thinking your application security building it to operations, and we want to make sure that we're baking things in. So from an agenda perspective, I'll go over some core security principles. Hopefully this is just review, and I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on just to kind of set the stage, and then just talk about the elements that I see that really help support not only audits that likely come with many of the applications you are responsible for, but understanding how to deploy security technologies into production to help protect those applications, and then working our way down through event logs, access control, configuration management, encryption, penetration testing are kind of the things that I've identified as potential interesting topics. Of course, there's always ones that can slip and we can add in. In fact, from our in-person discussion, the encryption slide worked its way in there because it is an important topic to add in. So by all means, this isn't necessarily all-encompassing, but does start the conversation and bring us to a nice place, I think. So this is a little bit small, at least on my screen. We had a nice big projector where we did this, so I won't try and make you read the fine print, but you probably at some point heard about the CIA triad, which is basically the confidentiality, integrity, and availability focus for information security. And really, I think, and I've said this a million times, though, the IT folks as well as general employees to organizations I've worked with, that security is everyone's business, not just the information security folks. So, understanding confidentiality and integrity and availability is obviously a charge of likely all of you in some capacity. And it all comes down to that people and the process that we're talking about here with integrating security into your development and operations game, as well as the technologies you choose to help to do that. So architecture documentation, this is probably the bane of everyone in IT's existence because of the fact that we like to implement technology and make it work as opposed to document how we did it and how it's continuing to be done. But the reality is, from a security perspective, if you don't know where the systems reside, what type of system they're running on, what operating systems are running, what versions of those, all the different components they're in, the ports and protocols that are used, all those things build a picture of understanding where the weak points or potential security flaws that may be in the design. If it's not designed and documented, obviously that becomes a lot more difficult to do. And again, these things not only support compliance, but just basically any of the components of your security program underlying that. And one thing we're really seeing a uptick in our consulting space is projects around microsegmentation. With the textbooks, I look back and I can see this talked about a lot now with virtual technologies and virtual networking technologies being built into data centers. Really an awesome time for being able to microsegment, and that architecture documentation obviously goes a long way to helping that become a reality. Being able to segment one server to the next, being able to communicate over the specific ports that are required is very powerful from a security perspective. So event logs. This is something I've worked in since I started within the information security space about 25 years ago. And it's been an ongoing battle to try and figure out how to get value out of audit logs and event logs. Windows has come a ways, I would say, from the beginning. The SIMs that support being able to analyze the logs have come a long way. But in the development arena and the operations, you have an opportunity to enable logging in the proper fashion. And usually your information security team will have that kind of documentation to help deliver that. But it is important to make sure that even in your development of the application, your event logs aren't only designed to help support troubleshooting the application, but to also support the ongoing potential investigations that will need to ensue based off of the application being in production. So really key component for the cybersecurity operations folks, because just make sure here I'm here seeing something about being kicked off. Hopefully everybody, can you still hear me?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Okay, sorry. So these event logs will, obviously support the ongoing efforts that investigations will need to support. So if decisions are being made behind the scenes on, what the audit policy is on that Windows server that it's running on, or Linux, Unix system, or even the logs coming out of the application need to support the requirements. So working with those security teams early on, I heard Stan and Jeff speak to this already, but the earlier you get them in the game, if you are a development or DevOps team or using this methodology, bringing those security folks into your purview early and often is going to help support this. Access controls. Certainly within your applications, more than likely all of them have some level of authentication associated. Understanding what the requirements are from an organization and risks tolerance standpoint, what the access control should be. Should it be two-factor authentication? The separation of duties that should be considered to make sure that the person that initiates a wire transaction, as an example, isn't the one that can approve it for transmittal. Real simple scenario that you wouldn't want to have somebody being able to do that, but in every business process or most business processes, depending on the risk levels, you need to understand who should be able to do what, and separating those things is highly important. Even from a development standpoint, having developers doing QA or having admin in QA can throw off the QA process, as well as any developers or QA that have access to production. Those sorts of things become logistically challenging in some organizations, depending on the size and budgets. But obviously, you want to try and build in those controls as best you can. So, and then just testing, that continuous integration component that again was spoken of by Jeff and Stan. Those are key to understanding that your controls that you're designing into your code are actually functioning. And configuration management, again, this is probably something you struggle with on at least a monthly basis when Microsoft Tuesday happens. Depending on the operating system you're using, there could be more or less of those. But really, making sure that, again, you interface with that information security team member that is helping you to guide this program is key. They more than likely have hardening guidelines that are associated with the operating systems that you're using within the organization, and making sure those get applied to each of those servers that are within the infrastructure of that application that you're designing to deliver to production is key to keeping configuration management in check. With virtual technologies, this becomes relatively cookie cutter if you follow the process and make sure that, again, these hardening guidelines are agreed upon and functional. At the end of the day, the application has to function, but those hardening guidelines will lock down services and components that are unnecessary or need to be locked down a little bit more. Encryption. So this is the topic that came up in our in-person. The communication between servers, if it's using an SSL-based encryption communication, TLS 1.2 is really the only version out there that hasn't been cracked at this point, or at least the least version. And those types of things need to be analyzed to ensure that if you're setting up encryption, there's obviously a reason behind that. The data that's traversing across that channel is considered sensitive. If you're using a broken encryption algorithm, obviously that becomes a lot easier to take a look at what that data is, and it will be targeted because it is attempted to be encrypted. So it is sort of the Pandora's box that somebody's going to want to open. And then really where the conversation came from in our in-person was around database encryption. So the user that was in the room with us stated that one of his main requirements when he was evaluating applications, commercial off-the-shelf applications, which I don't know if anyone is actually developing COTS software, but certainly if there are people out there that are requiring database encryption, which is not always an easy thing to bolt on afterwards, is considered when you're designing the application to begin with. If you build it from the beginning to incorporate the encryption levels that are required for the application, the data that it's housing, you're going to be in a lot better shape when it comes time to go to production. That security person may take a look and say, this encryption level is not sufficient, or it's not encrypted at all, we can't use it. Is the worst case scenario. And then if there are communication channels that have been set up between systems, especially if it is sensitive data, no matter how far within the data center you may think they are, the reality is that hackers and malicious insiders to your organization do have the capability to sniff network traffic, internal and do. In a lot of our engagements for penetration testing, it's one of the first things we'll do is turn on the most simple free shareware tools that do network sniffing, and pull credentials, pull hashes of credentials, and pull data streams and look for sensitive data within them. It's just the reality of the world that we live in, and it's not hard to get physical access to those facilities in some way, shape, or form. So it kind of leads down the road of penetration testing. I know within the conversations that we've heard from earlier that penetration testing at some level is happening within the integration testing, et cetera. But the reality is without a physical person that is well versed in this space, the automated tools only go so far. So basically any compliance program has some level of regular testing required under it. If you're not under requirements from a compliance standpoint, it's still a best practice in the world and should be considered, especially when you have major infrastructure changes or introductions of new components to your application. And just make sure that you're kind of going through the whole stack, testing your, infrastructure, testing any security controls that you have in place that you're expecting to do something, whether it's a SIM in place that sees an event from the event log that would trigger concern if it's using, PowerShell is not used within any of the systems that you are managing, which is, relatively unlikely because it is a very powerful tool. but if you see an event that is out of the ordinary, like a PowerShell of sorts, maybe you want to make sure that that is being alerted upon in production. And then, doing web-based application pen testing. If you're just doing, operating system and versioning and all the sort of well-known penetration routes, that may not be sufficient because some users may be authorized for certain things, but those controls we talked about from an access control standpoint or segregation of duties are important to test that they are functional within your production environment, because good users or authorized users for one function may not be authorized for another function, and if they do find a way to get through that, or maybe even a lower level account gets compromised and they elevate their privileges to that higher level, obviously those things can become concerning. And testing for that is important, and automation is only goes so far, like I said. So with that, I will transition it over. We've got 9 minutes left. I'm not sure, Todd, if you want to ask or try to answer any questions. I know we were talking about just doing questions after the fact, but I'll hand it back over to you to close things out.
Great. Thank you, Neil. As Neil had alluded to, we're going to go ahead and take all questions that you have offline. The intent here is, I know that we had a handful when we did the event within the Delaware local user group, but we were thinking, wouldn't it be great if any of the questions that you guys have, go ahead and type those in, and then what we'd like to do is, after the fact, in about a day or so, this recording is going to be available. Of course, some of the assets that were mentioned will also be available. So what we'd like to do is have you submit any questions that you have, or I guess there's already a couple that have come through, so if there's any additional questions that you have, please put those in now, and we'll go ahead and answer those offline and have them available to you. Because, again, from the way that this worked in the event, what ended up happening is each speaker had kind of their own perspective, and it became a very interesting dialogue for many of the folks. I would like to thank Stan, Jeff, and Neil for them spending the time today to go ahead and talk through this and share these ideas with us. Stan, thank you for making the report available that you were able to go ahead and cover, and sharing some of those insights into the true state of security and DevOps today. Jeff, thank you for the link for Secure CI. That was something I wasn't familiar with. I've got it bookmarked and ready to download to explore a little bit more about the tools that you've made easily accessible and available for those of us that would like to do a little bit more in some security testing. And Neil, I know that you've got a busy schedule on the road, so thank you very much for taking that time out again today. As you can see, Protect 2017 is coming up quickly. It will be the 11th through the 13th of September in Washington, D.C. If you haven't done so already, there is a $200 savings if you use this link to be able to register. So, again, you can see that there's a number of reasons why you would definitely want to participate. I know typically Stan and Jeff are there. I know that from a Vivint perspective, I will have the opportunity to present a session as well. So look forward to seeing everybody there if you can make it. And then lastly, if you haven't figured this out yet, so Vivint is predominantly a volunteer-led organization, always looking for new volunteers. I myself am a volunteer for a very long time, and really what Vivint is out to do is to support our service goals of advocacy, community, and education. So again, hopefully this webinar has helped to provide some of that insight and some more education that you could leverage. So I guess with that, again, on behalf of Vivint Worldwide, what you will see is a survey at the end of this, which will pop up. I appreciate you taking a few moments to fill that out and provide us with any feedback. But I think that's going to go ahead and wrap up this live webinar for today. So with that, I will say thank you very much. Again, thanks to all of our speakers and to the participants for participating in the event today. Thank you all. Bye.